Hello and welcome to Lecture 6 of the Romantic Era. Today we're going to do a compare and contrast on the two most significant composers of the 19th century in terms of the piano, specifically. And those are Frédéric Chopin and Franz Liszt. So let's start with Chopin. Although he has a French-sounding name because his father was in fact French, he is generally regarded to be Polish. He was born in Poland. His father was a teacher of French language in Poland. His mother was Polish. And Chopin it's hard to overstate how significant he is in terms of like the history of the piano. I would say that after the inventor of the piano himself, Bartolomeo Cristofori, I think that maybe Chopin, you could make a case, is the most significant figure other than Cristofori, the inventor of the instrument. I think you could look at the keyboard technique generally from the very beginnings of keyboard instruments back in the Renaissance, the harpsichord and the organ, and look at keyboard technique and how it evolved. And I think you get to Chopin and there's sort of like BC and AC, before Chopin and after Chopin. His approach to the piano was so new and so original and utterly unmistakable. When you listen to Chopin's music, you can't really mistake it for anything else. And I've been talking, of course, only in terms of the piano, because that's pretty much what Chopin specialized in, was just the piano. There are a couple of pieces for cello and piano. There are some songs in Polish, and this is kind of a manifestation of Chopin's Polish nationalism or patriotism. He was a proud Pole and lived for pretty much his whole adult life as an expat living in Paris, as an exile from Poland, for reasons I'll explain. And he wrote a couple of piano concertos, works for piano and orchestra, but all of the rest of his music is for solo piano. He never wrote a symphony or an opera or a string quartet or anything that didn't involve piano. And again, the vast majority of his music is for solo piano. And of that music, most of that are what we call character pieces. He did write 3 sonatas, the first of which is hardly ever played. It was composed when he was a student at Warsaw Conservatory. The second and third sonatas are played all the time, and they are big works, big multi-movement works, kind of in the mold of, let's say, a middle or late Beethoven sonata or a Schubert sonata or whatever. But all the rest of his works for solo piano are character pieces, relatively brief pieces that have this descriptive title. So Chopin, again, wasn't born into a family of professional musicians. His father was a teacher of French language, but he was given instruction at an early age, and from very early on, it was apparent that Chopin had tremendous natural talent and sort of intuition for the piano. In fact, we know very little about Chopin's first music teacher. One interesting fact about him is if you go to any big encyclopedia, like the Encyclopedia Britannica or whatever, 26 volumes, and you go to the volume of Z, and you find the very last entry in the encyclopedia, usually it is Chopin's music teacher, whose name was Zwiny, Z-W-Y-N-Y, Zwiny. And we know almost nothing about Zwiny except that he was Chopin's teacher. And probably the only reason we know anything about him is because his pupil went on to be maybe the most significant composer for the piano. It's thought that this Zwiny might not have actually even been a pianist himself. Like maybe he was a violinist, but who knew some piano, but he was available to teach Chopin. So in terms of pianistic technique, Chopin seems to have been more or less self-taught. He kind of developed his own very unique and, at the time, very challenging style. I mean, it's still challenging today, but back during Chopin's lifetime, even when he was, let's say, a teenager, the things that he was composing, only he and maybe 3 or 4 other people in the world would have been capable of playing. And in fact, there were some other musicians, composers, music publishers who took a look at his music and said, "Well, this is impossible. There's no way anyone could play this." But of course, Chopin could, and Liszt could, and a few other people could. And nowadays, it's standard, repertoire. It's still, much of it is challenging, but it is standard because, again, we're living in the post-Chopin age, and his techniques have been sort of incorporated into the sort of palette of available techniques for the piano. Chopin was, however, classically trained, that is, thoroughly trained in composition. He attended the Warsaw Conservatory, and I'm sure there was probably no one there who could tell him anything about piano, but he did receive kind of formal instruction in composition. And he was already composing some of his greatest works when he was in his late teens, 18, 19 years old, including his etudes, which are really these revolutionary pieces in terms of piano technique. We'll talk about those in a moment. But a little bit about Chopin's life story. When he graduated from the Warsaw Conservatory, he went on a concert tour to sort of promote himself, left Poland, and played in various cities. While he was away from Poland on this concert tour, I believe he was 19 years old. This is at a time when Poland was at least part of Poland. Poland had been partitioned, and the eastern half of Poland was under the domination of the Russians. The Poles were not very happy about this. There was a big uprising in Warsaw. The Russians cracked down. And as a result, Chopin never went back to his home country. Instead, he settled in Paris. And for the rest of his life, about another 20 years, because Chopin sadly died young. He was born in 1810, died of tuberculosis in 1849. For the rest of his life, Chopin did not really perform an awful lot. For someone of his incredible ability, this is a little unusual, but there are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, he had tuberculosis, which he contracted probably, sometime in childhood. And tuberculosis today, it's easily treatable, but back then they didn't really have much treatment. But it was a kind of a disease that killed you slowly. And so, if you've ever seen the movie Tombstone, the Doc Holliday character has tuberculosis, and that's why he's sick and he's coughing all the time. So this is true of Chopin as well. He was very often ill, physically weak, and it takes a certain amount of sort of strength and stamina to play concerts, to go on tour, to travel from one city to the next, and just have the physical and mental energy to be able to do this, and Chopin very often did not. But also he was a very sort of shy, introverted type of person, and he didn't enjoy the feeling of playing for big crowds. The way, for example, someone like Franz Liszt, who we'll talk about a little bit later, played the biggest crowds possible. He played in opera houses, would play solo piano recitals in opera houses. Chopin didn't do that. He mostly played in these smaller, intimate gatherings in what were known as salons. So a salon concert is simply a private concert given usually like in the living room or in the ballroom or whatever of some wealthy socialite. And these salons are basically like parties, but they had a sort of a cultural enrichment aspect to them. So the hostess would invite maybe a famous painter, and his paintings would be displayed, or maybe a poet, and the poetry would be recited, or a musician like Chopin, who would play one of these sort of private house parties, maybe for 50, 100 people at most. And so this is the kind of the atmosphere where Chopin really thrived. And so he played these kinds of concerts, but not big concerts. Chopin probably only played something like 40 or 50 big public concerts his whole life. He was really more into the small, intimate gathering. And the way that he made his living in Paris was not so much, therefore, as a performer, but more as a composer, having his works published, and as a teacher. And most of Chopin's students were basically the daughters of very wealthy members of the nobility or industrialists, bankers, whatever, living in Paris. And Chopin's students were often excellent pianists. I mean, they played at a professional level, but again, this was at a time when women were discouraged from pursuing a career as a professional musician, at least as an instrumentalist. And so they weren't necessarily playing public concerts, but they were some of probably the best pianists in the world, because Chopin was pretty particular. He wouldn't take you as a student unless you were very advanced. A little bit more about Chopin's life. He never married, but he did have a lifelong, they sort of broke up actually toward the end of Chopin's life, but through most of his adult life, he was in a serious relationship with the author George Sand. George Sand is a pen name. That's not her real name. Her real name was Aurore Dudevant, but you may know her as George Sand. And they made kind of an interesting couple, because George Sand, in addition to having this male pen name and doing what was considered like a man's job, which is, writing books. This is why women authors very often had these pen names, because it was easier to get published under a man's name, and your books would sell better. But she was also kind of a masculine woman. She preferred to wear pants, trousers, at a time when women did not wear pants. She smoked cigars, apparently. She liked to curse. So she was kind of a what we might consider a masculine woman. And Chopin was kind of a sensitive, shy, maybe effeminate man. About his music then. Let's see what the book says. And I'm here on page 238 in the 2025 edition of the Camion text. By the age of 18, Chopin had evolved an utterly personal and original style. Most of his pieces are exquisite miniatures. They evoke an infinite variety of moods and are always elegant, graceful, and melodic. Unlike Schumann, Chopin did not attach literary programs or titles to his pieces. Actually, there are a few that have a literary title, ballade, suggesting a ballad or poetry. The mazurkas and polonaises, stylized dances, capture a Polish spirit without actually using folk tunes. No other composer has made the piano sound as beautiful as Chopin. Just a second here. We've finally gotten to composers who have lived long enough to have been photographed. So I'm just going to take a second and do a little sidebar. This is one of, I believe, only 2 photographs taken of Chopin. And as you can see, this one was taken in 1849, the very last year of his life. Anyway, so let's actually first talk about the kinds of pieces that Chopin wrote, and then we'll talk about some of the technical details, what makes them so extraordinary, and all of that. So, again, the book describes them as exquisite miniatures. We can think of Chopin as more of like a poet than a novelist. He did write some big works like the sonatas, but what he really excelled in were these brief character pieces. And Chopin's character pieces have a variety of different titles. I'm going to go over some of them now in no particular order. The first one the book mentions is the Nocturne. So Chopin wrote many pieces with the title Nocturne. He didn't invent this title, actually. He borrowed it from a composer, an Irish composer named John Field, who is kind of a major influence on Chopin. If you listen to John Field's music, it sounds sort of like you can hear what Chopin picked up from it. So a nocturne, what does that mean exactly? Well, it has something to do with night. So the book translates it as a night piece. So it is usually sort of introverted, very melodic, contemplative, not usually, the tempo is almost always slow, right? Not usually overly dramatic, and usually, having like sort of softer tones for the most part, again, associated with night, sort of the mood of night. Also in these pieces, very often there is a melody in the right hand, just in single notes, sort of like a vocal type of melody. And Chopin was a master at creating melodies that sounded so like singable, sort of like opera. In fact, Chopin was a great admirer of opera. He went to the opera all the time. But he never himself composed an opera. Instead, he took that sort of that melodic style and put it into his piano pieces, particularly the nocturnes. It's sometimes referred to as bel canto style. Bel canto is it's Italian for beautiful singing. So very often, it's particularly in the nocturnes, the right hand has this beautiful singing melody that imitates the kinds of inflections that opera singers would do, like the ornamentation and the trills and things like this. So we have an example of a nocturne, one of Chopin's best known pieces, in your listening. The next example that they have here is an etude. So, and again, Chopin wrote dozens of these etudes, and I'll talk about the significance of this particular etude and the others that are part of his Opus 10, his 10th published work, was a set of 12 etudes. So the word etude is just the French word for study. And in fact, the French use the word study where we, in the English-speaking world, might use the word practice. Like, I need to go practice the piano. They would say, I need to go study the piano. So an etude is a practice piece, meaning a piece that you play sort of as an exercise to develop your technique. And composers had been writing etudes for a very, very long time before Chopin, either with the title etude or exercise or something like that. A piece that is not meant to be performed publicly, is not even necessarily meant to sound particularly good, but is meant to develop some particular technique like scales or arpeggios or octaves or something like this. So what's different about Chopin's etudes is, first of all, these are the first etudes that I'm aware of that are both invaluable technical exercises and also beautiful pieces of music that can be performed for people, right? And are still to this day some of the best loved solo piano repertoire. So they are not just practice pieces. They do double duty. They do develop your technique, but they are beautiful pieces that you can play in a public concert. But also, maybe the uniqueness of Chopin's etudes is that each one of them exploits some particular technical problem, technical challenge, and in the act of learning the piece, hopefully you overcome that challenge. Although some of these pieces are so challenging that even a professional pianist will play them every day just to feel confident enough to be able to play them in a concert. This first set of etudes, as I said, Opus 10, so Chopin's 10th published work. It's composed when he was only 18 or 19 years old, and these are utterly revolutionary. Now I know you see there's a title of this piece. It's called the Revolutionary Etude. It doesn't have to do with a revolution in piano playing, although there is a revolutionary kind of approach. It's kind of hard to describe without having a keyboard here to demonstrate, but I think you'll see when you click on the links that I'll post in the announcement. If you just go on YouTube and search for Chopin Etude and find a professional pianist playing them, and I will include some links to some, but you can see some of what I'm talking about. So for example, in this set of 10, the very first one, Opus 10 number 1, has this extremely, this sort of hyper arpeggio that you have to spread your hand out and contract. You have to have very flexible hands. It's not really necessarily about strength. It's about flexibility and relaxation. But at the time, this very first Chopin etude, some expert pianists looked at it and said, well, this is impossible. I mean, you can write this down, but nobody could play that. Well, people do. The second etude from this set in A minor, it features in the right hand, you have to play a chromatic scale just with your upper 3 fingers of your right hand and chords at the same time with the lower 2 or sometimes 3 fingers of the hand. You have to do this simultaneously, so it sounds like 2 hands in one, and it's at a very fast speed. It's extremely difficult to do. So each one of these etudes has some particular challenge. The one that is featured in this etude in C minor, this is Opus 10 number 12. This is the last of this set of 12 etudes. Is extremely rapid scales in the left hand, while the right hand has this sort of big, powerful chords and melody embedded within those chords. What is the revolution? What's revolutionary about it? Well, it was given this sort of subtitle. Chopin did not himself call it the revolutionary etude, but many of these etudes of Chopin have acquired little nicknames, sort of like the way Beethoven sonatas, like the Moonlight Sonata. He never called it the Moonlight Sonata. It's a nickname that was kind of attached by later generations. So this one was called the Revolutionary Etude. I mean, it sounds very passionate and dramatic, and it was apparently composed during the July of 1830 revolutions in Paris. So there was an uprising, an overthrow of the French government in 1830, and there were, riots in the streets and barricades and soldiers versus protesters, and Chopin witnessed all of this because he was living in Paris at the time, and it is supposed or imagined that perhaps this dramatic clashing in the streets of Paris in 1830 may have been sort of expressed by Chopin in this piece. We don't really know. Chopin did not give like specific subtitles to indicate what his pieces were about. They did have descriptive titles. An etude is a descriptive title. Nocturne is a descriptive title, but he didn't really go any farther than that. He just wanted to give a suggestion. He didn't want to tell exactly what he was thinking or what inspired him necessarily. Moving on, there's another piece by Chopin. This is one of his best-known pieces, which is mentioned in your listening. This is the Polonaise in A-flat major, sometimes called the Heroic Polonaise. Again, not a subtitle that Chopin thought up, but it does sound very heroic. And so what a Polonaise is, you can almost see the word Poland in there. It's sort of like the Polish national dance, especially of the nobility, of the upper classes. And it has a distinctive rhythmic pattern, which corresponds to the dance step. It's like yum da da dum bum 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 ba da dum bum bum bum. It's in triple meter and usually at sort of a moderate pace, and often has sort of like militaristic overtones. And in this famous Polonaise, in the middle section, it's in ternary form, A-B-A form, very familiar form to us, hopefully by now. That contrasting B section has this very difficult repeated octaves in the left hand. You have to play these octaves over and over and over again. And it's sort of meant to suggest, at least people believe, it's meant to suggest like the famous Polish cavalry riding off into battle. So those are 3 of the different titles that we sometimes see in Chopin's music, and he composed many nocturnes, many etudes, many polonaises. I'm just going to mention some other titles of Chopin works. So for example, the title Impromptu, it's a piece that is meant to sound improvised, and Chopin was a great improviser, as were most classical musicians back then. So an impromptu is a piece that that sounds like an improvisation, although it's actually written down. And it's also, by the way, the title of a movie that was made probably about 25, 30 years ago about Chopin and Liszt, which you could check out. It's kind of a silly little movie, but it does give you a feeling for the time and these two characters. It's actually about Chopin and his relationship with George Sand, and also his relationship with Franz Liszt, who was a close friend of Chopin, and about Liszt's relationship with his girlfriend slash baby mama at the time, who was another author who wrote under a pen name, Daniel Stern. Her real name was Marie Dagoult. She was a countess, and she had this relationship with Chopin, with Liszt, and it's sort of about these two couples and their interaction. So check out the movie Impromptu about Chopin and Liszt. It stars Hugh Grant as Chopin and Julian Sands, I believe, as Franz Liszt. Anyway, so Impromptu, another title. I think I mentioned Ballade. Some of Chopin's greatest works are the four ballades. The ballades, again, the title suggests sort of something poetic, like a poem, a ballad. And these are apparently inspired by a particular Polish poet that Chopin knew in Paris and admired, and sort of, I guess those were the inspiration for the ballades of Chopin. These ballades do have a sort of they all have this distinctive rhythmic pattern, or this meter, 6/8, that kind of corresponds to perhaps the poetic meter of whichever poems that in Polish, which Chopin was inspired by. Some other works. There are 4 scherzos by Chopin, and these are kind of unusual in that, if you remember, a scherzo is very typically a movement in a symphony or a sonata, especially Beethoven and later. Remember, I talked back in the classical era about how Beethoven began substituting the scherzo as the dance-like movement in a multi-movement work instead of the minuet, because the minuet had become kind of stodgy and old-fashioned. So scherzo is a fast piece, has fast tempo, it's energetic, and the title simply means joke. So it's supposed to sound kind of humorous or joking or lighthearted or whatever, and Beethoven scherzos usually do. Chopin scherzos are very dark and dramatic. They are fast and in triple meter, as scherzos generally are, but they are not at all lighthearted. Well, the last one is a bit lighthearted, but the first 3 are very serious and dramatic, dark-colored kind of works in minor keys. Chopin also wrote an entire set of preludes, 24 preludes, and these are probably inspired by his love of J.S. Bach, who, of course, wrote the 24 preludes and fugues, which I think I mentioned, actually 2 sets of 24 preludes and fugues. And each prelude and fugue is in a different major and minor key, going through all the different major and minor keys. Chopin did something similar, composed a set of 24 preludes, each one very brief for the most part. You could play through the whole thing in like 20, 25 minutes. And I mean, some of these preludes are only like 30 seconds long. Others are maybe, 3 or 4 minutes long. But they all have very, very different personalities, each in a different key, and some of Chopin's most popular works. Chopin wrote many waltzes. The waltz was the most popular dance of the 19th century. Chopin's waltzes are like stylized waltzes. They're too fast to dance to. You may have heard of the minute waltz. I'm trying to think of pieces of Chopin that, even if you are not a classical music fan, you might be familiar with the minute waltz. You might have heard it and maybe not known what it was or who it was by. But also, I'm thinking now, the famous funeral march. Yom pom 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 yom da 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 dum da dum. That's actually the slow movement from Chopin's second sonata, known as his Funeral March Sonata. If you ever wondered who wrote that thing, that's Chopin. So I mentioned J.S. Bach before. I was just about to mention about like influences on Chopin in terms of composition. In terms of piano style, Chopin is pretty original and unique, and it's not so much who influenced him as who he in turn influenced, which is a whole bunch of people, beginning with Franz Liszt, the next composer I'll talk about. But in terms of influences on Chopin, there is some influence of John Field, as I mentioned before. Chopin loved J.S. Bach and Mozart. Apparently didn't care that much for Beethoven. And actually, there are very few composers that, if you read Chopin's letters, that he expresses much admiration for. Apparently not a big fan of Schubert. Didn't really much like Schumann's music, even though he was a friend of Schumann. So I would say, there's definitely the influence of Mozart, definitely the influence of Bach, but it's hard to find, and certainly Beethoven is an influence on everybody, but I think there's some aspects of Beethoven's style that, like the drama and the stress and the whatever, that might have seemed a bit much to Chopin. Chopin was, again, kind of a reserved person, but I should say another very important aspect of Chopin is his harmonic ingenuity. That is, he had a tremendous feel for the piano itself, but then he had also a tremendous sense of harmony, of using chords in interesting, unexpected ways, having modulations that go from one key to an unexpected key that gives a really dramatic kind of sound. So definitely a major innovator in the area of harmony as well as piano technique. Let's now talk about Franz Liszt, sort of comparing and contrasting. So Liszt, like Chopin, like pretty much all the other composers that we talked about, not born into a family of professional musicians, although his father was a decent amateur musician, and maybe even, you could say, semi-professional. Liszt's father actually worked for the Esterházy family. Remember, the Esterházy family was the family that had employed Joseph Haydn for almost 30 years. Haydn was the court composer of this very wealthy Hungarian noble family, the Esterházys. And Liszt's father worked for the Esterházy family as well, as sort of a manager for their estates. The Esterházys owned tremendous tracts of land, which they farmed, and they also grazed sheep for their wool. And apparently, I think Liszt's father was sort of in terms of what he did, he was managing the sheep flocks of the Esterházy family, was sort of a farm steward. But he was also apparently a decent cellist, and occasionally even played in the orchestra that Franz Joseph Haydn conducted. So did have a musical background, and had a piano at home, and his little son Franz, when he was probably 5 or 6 years old, just immediately showed tremendous talent for the piano. And so it was thought, well, we should give this boy some lessons. Who should we take him to? They decided to go to Vienna and bring Liszt to study with a man named Karl Czerny. So Czerny was a student of Beethoven, and this is when Beethoven was still alive. So you can see Liszt was born in 1811. Around 1817, I believe, Liszt began studying with Czerny. And this is at a time when Beethoven was still alive. Beethoven did hear the young Franz Liszt. Well, he didn't hear. He saw the young Franz Liszt play. This was a time when Beethoven was pretty much deaf. But I'm sure Beethoven could see, even if he couldn't hear, that Liszt was just phenomenally talented. And he really had the ideal instruction from Czerny, because what Czerny focused on, Czerny was famous for writing thousands and thousands of these etudes, technical exercises. He was a master at developing technique. Now, these Czerny etudes, which are still used today by students, and there are literally thousands and thousands of them, multiple books of these exercises with every possible technical challenge you can think of. They are not meant to be, they're not like the Chopin type of etude, which is meant to be performed publicly. You won't see people playing them in concerts, but they are very useful technical pieces. So Liszt had this combination of extraordinary natural talent, but also maybe the best possible discipline and training for his technique, directly from a student of Beethoven who specialized in developing technique. So there's definitely a good match, and Liszt definitely benefited from Czerny's instruction. But Liszt had just some kind of phenomenal natural talent. So for one thing, technically he could play anything, right? And other pianists would very often be quite upset and jealous when they could see what Liszt could do. And he was also maybe one of the best sight readers in musical history. So not only could he play anything, he could usually play it the first time he saw it without even needing to practice. So, for example, and there are many, many accounts of other musicians seeing what Liszt could do, and just it was jaw-dropping. So Clara Schumann, remember, great prodigy herself. I've made a big deal about how Clara Schumann was one of the leading pianists of the 19th century. Clara Schumann said, "Franz Liszt can play at first sight what the rest of us struggle with for months and get nowhere with." Mendelssohn, again, I put Mendelssohn up there as, maybe tied with Mozart as one of the greatest child prodigies in music history. There's a letter from Mendelssohn that he wrote, I believe, either to his mother, to somebody, doesn't really matter. But Mendelssohn is talking about an experience he had. He said, "I happened to be in the piano store, the Erard Piano Gallery, and Liszt was there. And he said to me, 'Oh, what's that under your arm?' I had this manuscript of my piano concerto that I'm working on, and I had it with me, and Liszt asked to see it. And I said, 'Oh, it's a mess. You're not going to be able to make any sense. It's not a clean copy.' And Liszt said, 'No, let me take a look at it.' So he said, Liszt puts it on the piano, flips through it, and just played it perfectly at sight, better than I could have even imagined that it could be played." So this is Mendelssohn about his own concerto, and Liszt is playing it perfectly from a messy handwritten score that he has just seen for the first time. And there's story after story after story about Liszt and this phenomenal sight reading ability he had and this phenomenal technique. So anyway, Liszt it goes on a world tour, or let's say a European European tour with his father, very similar to, sort of like in the mold of Mozart, touring Europe, playing for famous people and rich people and royalty and all of that. But when he's 16 years old, Liszt has sort of a series of personal crises. First of all, his father died while they were out on tour. And Liszt was far from home. I believe he was in Paris. So his father died, and then he also had a relationship with a student of his, a piano student, who was of the nobility. She was his student, but some love interest developed between them, but her father disapproved because Liszt was a mere piano player and not of the nobility, and so forbade his daughter to see Liszt, and Liszt was heartbroken young teenager. And he began to wonder, what am I doing with my life? Going around playing for, like a trained monkey. Maybe I should just quit music altogether. Maybe I should become a priest. He had these sort of religious inclinations and longings, and had this idea of becoming a priest. So he's thinking about what he should do, and he's sort of in a funk. And then he goes to a concert given by the violinist Niccolò Paganini. And Paganini, which I think he is mentioned in the book, because this piece by Liszt, which is in your listening example, La Campanella, the melody is taken from a violin concerto movement by Paganini. So Paganini actually wrote the melody, and Liszt wrote this set of variations on this melody. Campanella, by the way, means little bells. So the melody sounds like little bells ringing. So Liszt, 16 or 17-year-old Liszt, goes to this concert and hears Paganini. Paganini was just the phenomenal performer of the day on the violin, really on any instrument. He was just superhuman. And he was a very interesting, macabre kind of character. You can find pictures of Paganini on the internet or whatever. He had this sort of diabolical appearance. He had this long, stringy black hair. He had kind of a hollowed out looking face because he had contracted syphilis and took these treatments for syphilis, which caused his jaw muscle, or his jawbone, to sort of rot away because of, again, the heavy metals, the lead treatments that people took for syphilis. So he had this gaunt, he was like a skeleton with long hair playing the violin, and he played in a very distinctive way, like with the violin down like this and kind of hunched over. And he played to sold-out concert halls all over Europe. And these sort of rumors started about Paganini, that he actually sold his soul to the devil, and that's how he was able to play in this amazing way. And even there were rumors that the reason he had sold his soul to the devil is because he murdered his mistress, and the low G string on his violin was made from the guts of his mistress that he had murdered. I mean, all these fantastical stories, sort of like you might have about rock stars. So Paganini was really like the rock star equivalent of his day. To the extent, by the way, that when Paganini died, all of these rumors about Satanism and him selling his soul to the devil or whatever kind of hounded him to his grave. And when he died, there was like, well, we can't bury him in a churchyard if he's in league with Satan or whatever. And his body was kind of like left to rot in a church basement for a while. It's kind of very sad. But anyway, Paganini was one of these super virtuoso performers in an age, the 19th century, that was obsessed with virtuosity. Franz Liszt goes to hear this concert and is blown away and decides, now I know what I want to do with my life. I am going to make myself into the Paganini of the piano. So apparently he locked himself away for 3 years and practiced nothing but exercises for like 8 or 10 hours a day. All right. Now, he was already the best pianist in the world, probably, at age 16 or 17. But he locks himself away for 3 years after hearing Paganini and digs down even deeper. And when he emerges from this period of study, there is just nobody who is even close to Franz Liszt. So Liszt performed continuously, made a lot of money that way, also did quite a bit of teaching, although most of his teaching was done later in his life, and he actually taught lessons for free to very gifted students, but he didn't accept payment. He felt it was sort of like the obligation that he had of, that it was beneath him to accept payment. But of course, you had to be very, very advanced pianist indeed. He was not teaching beginners. So Liszt, for the next, let's say, about 18, 20 years, is a professional touring pianist playing all over the world, also composing. But when he was about 38 years old, I believe they mention, I think it's the year 1848, he decided, like, enough of this life as the traveling performer. I'm going to stop performing. He didn't quite completely stop performing, but I'm going to stop playing concerts for money, and instead I'm going to focus on composition. Now, he did still perform, but he didn't perform like, he performed as a conductor. He was one of the great conductors of the time. He did perform some on the piano, but he would usually donate the proceeds to some kind of a charity or other. So, for example, there was a year when the Danube River flooded, and there were lots of people left homeless. Lots of people lost their lives, and Liszt played charity concerts to raise money. Also organized a series of charity concerts and to put up a monument to Beethoven in the city of Bonn, where Beethoven had grown up. Although Beethoven is buried in Vienna, there was no monument to Beethoven in his hometown. So Liszt undertook this. So he decides to accept a position as court conductor at Weimar. Now, he was technically working for like the ruler of Weimar, but he wasn't like a court musician, like a servant, the way that Haydn was. He was basically the director of musical activities in the town of Weimar, and the conductor of the orchestra. And in this position, he was sort of like one of the leading champions of the radical camp. You know, remember I talked about this sort of spectrum of the more conservative composers like Mendelssohn, I would say probably Schumann as well, and then later Brahms, and the more radical composers like Berlioz, who was a close friend of Liszt's, like Liszt, and later Richard Wagner. So Liszt was a major figure in terms of sort of like paving the way for Wagner, who we're not going to get to talk about Wagner because we're going to run out of time in the semester, but Wagner may be the single most significant composer slash artist of any type in the 19th century. I say significant. Whether or not you enjoy his music or his views, whatever, he was definitely hugely influential and significant. And Liszt was a major influence on Wagner musically, but also a champion of Wagner, a major promoter of Wagner. Wagner actually ended up marrying Liszt's daughter and becoming his son-in-law as well. Anyway, so Liszt is definitely more on the music of the future, the radical side. Notice with Chopin, I neglected to mention whether he was more of a conservative, more of a radical. I think Chopin sort of stands above this. In some ways, he is kind of conservative. I mentioned that his two probably most important influences were Bach and Mozart, both composers of the past. But in his own way, Chopin was pretty radical, especially in terms of harmony and his approach to the piano. So it's harder to pin down Chopin as more conservative or more radical. He had both elements. But Liszt is definitely more interested in the music of the future, and he used this position as court composer, conductor in the town of Weimar to sort of push that agenda, to champion other like future-minded, future-oriented composers. Unlike most of the other composers that we talked about, Liszt did not die young. He lived to a pretty ripe old age of 75 years old, so he died in 1886. So lots of photographs of Franz Liszt. And during that time, he composed, obviously, first of all, a lot of piano music. And you can definitely hear the influence of Chopin on Liszt. Chopin and Liszt met, I think, when they were both teenagers. And Liszt, just was obviously overwhelmed with the music of Chopin. Chopin, in turn, admired Liszt's playing. In fact, there's a letter that Chopin wrote. He said, they happened to be in the room at the same time. He said, "Liszt is playing my etudes. I wish I could steal his manner of playing my own pieces from him." So Chopin admired Liszt's playing. I think he was probably not all that fond of Liszt's music. Liszt's music, as the book says, is kind of controversial. Because some people find some of it to be what we might say bombastic, like overly theatrical, overly flashy and showy, and maybe lacking in substance. And I think this is a fair criticism for some of Liszt's music, but not all of it. So, for example, the piece that's in your book, this Etude La Campanella, is definitely flashy and difficult, and it's not necessarily emotionally profound. But there are a lot of pieces by Liszt that are emotionally profound and deep, and not all of his music is technically flashy or dramatic, although much of it is. So, obviously very significant in terms of piano music. But unlike Chopin, Liszt was interested in other musical genres. So symphonic music. Liszt wrote two symphonies, both program symphonies. One of them is based on Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, which is it's an epic poem with three parts. Obviously, the famous Inferno is the first part, and then Purgatory, and then Paradise. So each of those are represented in the three movements of Liszt's Dante Symphony. And then there's also a Faust Symphony. So Faust is, or Dr. Faustus, is this work by Goethe. Here's Goethe again. About this professor, college professor, Dr. Faustus, who wants to gain all knowledge. Basically, he's been reading books and studying his whole life, and still he feels this yearning to know more, and he wants to know all there is to know, and he sells his soul to the devil. This kind of thing appealed to Liszt. He was very into, although he was a very religious person, he was a devout Catholic. Remember, I said earlier in his career he thought about giving up music and becoming a priest. On the one hand, he was a very deeply religious person, but on the other hand, he was kind of interested in this aspect of, like, as Berlioz was, as many other romantics were, of like the supernatural, right? Of the intrigue of this story of Faust. Apparently, he said, I carry that book around with me wherever I go. I have a little, I carry that, and I carry Dante's Inferno with me wherever I go. He was very inspired by these writings, and people said of Liszt that he, again, sort of like Paganini, he was like he was a man possessed when he played the piano. So symphonic music. Also, there's some religious music by Liszt. There are a couple of oratorios. Again, Liszt was a very deeply religious person. So I would say his main focuses were on solo piano music. There are also a couple of piano concertos, piano and orchestra, orchestral music, some vocal music, oratorios. Oh, and by the way, remember I mentioned back, I think in lecture 2, lecture 1 or 2 of the Romantic era, the symphonic poem. So this is a new genre for orchestra invented by Franz Liszt. It's sort of a medium-length work, always has a descriptive title, and there's like an allusion in the title to maybe literature or old mythology or legends or poems or some kind of, it could be a painting or some kind of extra musical association or story that is told in symphonic music. And there are other genres that are similar, like the concert overture or whatever, but this idea of something called a symphonic poem is an invention of Liszt that other composers also took up, writing their own symphonic poems. Liszt was, again, sort of like a rock star in his day. His concerts were packed, and he was very handsome. And women threw themselves at him. They would literally sometimes throw their jewels on stage as Liszt was playing. And Liszt would often leave behind his gloves. He would come out on stage, take off his gloves, leave them on the piano, and there were apparently scenes of like princesses and countesses fighting over the gloves, or fighting over this cigar butt that Liszt left somewhere. I mean, he was that level of rock star. And although he never married, he had many affairs. One in particular that I mentioned, he had this Countess Marie d'Agoult left her husband for Franz Liszt. They had 3 children, who Liszt did not. He was kind of I'm not going to say he's a deadbeat dad. He did support his children financially, but he didn't see them very much. One of his daughters went on to marry Richard Wagner. And their descendants, who ran the ran the Festival Opera House in Bayreuth for a long time. I think it's still a Wagner descendant. So the Wagner family not only are related to Richard Wagner, but also to Franz Liszt, because Liszt was Wagner's father-in-law. Later in life, he settled down with a princess who again left her husband for Liszt, and they were not allowed to marry, however, and stay within the Catholic Church. They were forbidden to marry, but nonetheless, later in life, Liszt actually did become not a full-fledged Catholic priest, but he took orders in the church, took holy orders, and became known as Abbe Liszt, or Father Liszt. I don't think he was not able to like say mass or give communion or things like that, but he did. I don't know exactly what level he rose to, but he took this rather seriously. He wore his sort of cassock, his like priestly garments very often, and people would joke, "Oh, look, there goes the devil disguised as a priest." Liszt was also there's some appealing aspects of Liszt in, first of all, like his generosity to other composers. So Liszt was, being a superstar, being very influential, in a position to help other composers. He was very generous. He promoted other composers' works, very often over his own works, and financially supported other composers. He was very generous with his time. Like, younger composers would come to him and ask his opinion of their works or whatever. And one of these charming stories of Liszt's superhuman abilities, the composer Edvard Grieg, whom you may know of from the Peer Gynt Suite, the Hall of the Mountain King. That's Edvard Grieg. He was a young, struggling composer, came to Liszt with a manuscript of a piano concerto he had just written. And so Liszt says, "Oh, okay, let me take a look at that." Puts it on the piano, flips through, and Grieg is, again, writing a letter, I think, back to his mother, talking about this experience. He said he flipped through the pages, then he put started to playing the piano part and the orchestra part. So a piano concerto is for piano and orchestra, and even just the piano part is big and difficult, but somehow working in also the orchestral part, with a cigar in his fingers. Still, he would sometimes play, with his cigar. So he liked to smoke cigars, and Grieg said, I watched all of this, and I think I started to laugh. I laughed like an idiot. It was just such an overwhelming experience seeing his piece played perfectly at first sight, that his natural reaction was laughter. Anyway, so Liszt, very helpful to other composers and pianists. As I said, later in life, he gave lessons for free, weekly group lessons, to anyone who was basically good enough to play for the greatest pianist in the world. And is another interesting sort of compare and contrast with Franz Liszt. The major airport in both their home countries is named for them. So if you fly into Warsaw, Poland, you're flying into Frederick Chopin International Airport. And if you fly into Budapest, the capital of Hungary, you are flying into Franz Liszt Airport. So, the piece that is in your listening is an etude by Liszt. Liszt wrote several different sets of etudes. Some he called concert etudes. Some he called transcendental etudes, meaning that, a transcendental level of technique or ability that is required to play these things. But 6 of his etudes are all inspired by works of Paganini, the violinist who was such a major inspiration to Liszt and an influence on Liszt. I would say the 3 biggest influences on Liszt were Chopin, Paganini, and Hector Berlioz, I think, in terms of his approach to the orchestra. And he was close friends with all of them. So 6 of Liszt's etudes are all based on these different, what Paganini called caprices, or in this case, actually, it's a movement from Paganini's violin concerto. So Liszt took these works that are sort of like etudes for violin that Paganini composed, and turned them into piano pieces. And this is one of Liszt's best-known works. I'm not sure who the performer is in your book, but I'll put up a video in the comments of one of my favorite performances of this piece. And I'll find a recording of the violin version, the original, by Paganini. So that pretty much wraps things up for Chopin and Liszt. Good luck on your test on the Romantic era, and we'll see you later.